your Tuesday night with me. This will be a series of lectures in which we just talk tools. For those who will eventually be watching at home, we have a live studio audience in front of us. And part that's to slow me down a little bit. The kinds of tools that we are going to talk about are sort of ingrained into me somewhat, and you'll see why in a second. So I may tend to rifle through things super fast. I'm relying upon those of you that are in the room to slow me down, put your hands in the air, shout at me, or if you really need to, throw something. But otherwise, if something's like, whoa, 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 what just happened, please do let me know. In terms of what my plan is here for this evening, at any rate, it's to talk about the basic editing experience that you can get in the Emacs text editor. What you're looking at on the screen right now is Emacs displaying some information. We'll look at how it's displaying it in the not too distant future. But in terms of laying out that plan, I'll sort of slowly reveal information as we go forwards here. The reason we might want to talk about something as mundane as a text editor is to sort of get beyond the learning curve that's associated with it. The traditional two text editors, Emacs and Vim, are notoriously sort of difficult to grasp and to sort of figure out why would you do it this way. I mean, to open a file, why do I have to press this obscene sequence of like Control X, Control F just to get some text to edit? And so people have characterized this in various ways. I'll pull up the first graphical aid down here. Someone put together this sort of view of the learning curve associated with some of the traditional editors. Some of the more modern editors, I think, play into this equally as well. Most of you who have used Windows at some point or other are familiar with Notepad. I mean, you open it up and you start typing and there's nothing to it. It wasn't until like the mid-2000s they added like a find and replace in it. So there just wasn't much to learn and it didn't offer much power, but nobody cared because serious folks didn't use it as a text editor. Some of you who have to SSH into things and are maybe at the beginning stages in your CS career will be familiar with Pico or its more modern ancestor Nano. And this is a dead simple text editor that at the bottom of the screen displays everything you can do with it pretty much. And so there's also not a lot to learn. It's handy if you're in a terminal and you have to edit something fast on the fly. Your more sort of IDE-centric editors like your Visual Studios, your Eclipses, and maybe, and this is arguable, maybe your Atoms and your VS Codes that folks use these days. There's quite a bit to learn, but like after you get over it, like it sort of becomes mundane and you just get your work done. Most of the time, these provide a nice interface to get work done and then get out of your way, more or less. Now, these bottom two are what we'll talk about and reference back to occasionally. If you've edited with VI before, you will understand this marked sort of increase right at the beginning of learning VI. You need not do anything more than open up a terminal, type VI, and then try and hit some keys and wonder what the hell is going on at this point. Because normally when I have a text editor and I type text, like I see text there. And so this characterization of VI as having sort of an infinite learning curve right at the beginning, like you have to learn 50 or 60 different things just to edit a text file right off the bat, is a source of great consternation and why many people abandon it. But there are good tutorials out there on how to get better at this that might sort of dim this down to not an infinite slope there, but something more. Emacs is the one that we'll focus on today. And it has a steep learning curve, but if you open up files in Emacs, you'll type things and actually see, oh, when I press A, an A goes into that file most of the time. And when I type L or space, like the sort of normal things happens. Where it gets interesting is if you spend some time with this editor, you'll start to appreciate why people have characterized this as a sort of weird, like, whoa, wait a minute. I was doing it this way the whole time, but I could have been doing it this way instead. And you suddenly realize I didn't understand like how to use this thing in that way. Thus the sort of weird spiral pattern here associated with that learning curve. Now, you should always be suspicious of graphs like this where they don't even label their axes. Like, is this how much time I spend with it? And this is how much effort I have to apply? Or is this how much time and how much I'll know about things? So don't take this to heart too much. But it is reflective of the playful nature that Emacs folks tend to have. And it's my hope that our time together today and the video recording that hopefully results from this will get you guys over the initial sort of troublesome aspect of sort of just getting off the ground on that. The plan is to do a session in the future in which we discuss more tailoring of Emacs. And one of the reasons it has this shape, this strange loop as it were, is that you can tailor it to fit you. It's like a suit that is constantly reshaping to adjust for whatever weight you've gained or lost or muscles you've accrued. To that end, it's a constant sort of struggle for Emacs users to keep it customized and tailored in just the way that they want to. I probably would have finished my PhD a few years earlier if I hadn't spent so much time like trying to make this tool do the things in all the ways that I really wanted it to. Let's get to a few other aspects of this. Before we get too far in, I need to issue a few thanks. The first is the man in the booth. Without Joe Finnegan, we would have no sort of recording for this. We'll give him a round of applause later. I also want to thank the Computer Science Department for supporting this lecture series, advertising, which is probably why a few of you are out here, and also the Institute of Mathematics. They're lending us this room for this evening, and this is a good spot to do a recording, ample space for you guys, and a pretty good setup in terms of visualizations here. Finally, the students in the room and the students that I've seen in the past and will see in the future, thanks to all of you because you've given me a reason to do a lot of things in Emacs and also pestered me constantly like, how did you do that? To the point where I'm sick of repeating myself and I'm going to try to make some sort of a permanent record of this for further consumption. To relate to you my relationship to this text editor, a long time ago, like a few floors down from here, I took my first computer science class in this curriculum, University of Minnesota's computer science curriculum. It was CSI 1113. For those who aren't familiar, it's a C++ course. It was not supposed to be for computer science major at that point. I was a mechanical engineer. And then things went sideways, and they've never really recovered since then. Some forgotten TA told that the students in the class that he recommended that they use Emacs as their editor. And me being young and green, I was like, okay, fine, I haven't heard of this thing, and it's kind of weird. But the thing that sold me immediately is when he told me you need to hit tab more. Something sort of magical happened at that point. We were editing some code, and so I'm going to pull up some C code quickly just to sort of show you what I meant and what that initial impression was. All of the materials that we're going to be discussing here, they'll eventually be made available online, so if you're trying to jot notes at home, don't try too hard. All the stuff here will be available, including code we're going to look at. I just need to find this little application, and I have an unindented file here. Now, you don't necessarily have to be familiar with C code to understand that this is a bit ugly because all computer code that you'll encounter is supposed to be indented in a certain way. And what this long forgotten TA was sort of trying to impress upon me is like, I need to press tab more. And so dutifully, after having not indented anything in my code, I went through and started pressing tab. And I was confused because as I pressed tab, like it did nothing. For those of you who can't see my hands right now, I'm going to put on a little tool called Screen Key. It's available on most Linux distributions, so you can visualize up on the screen what exactly I'm typing to see what's there. So let me just turn that on quick. There's Screen Key. So down here, then, this little shaded area are going to show the keystrokes that I'm making as I go through. This is a handy one if you're presenting materials like that. But if I press tab repeatedly down here, it doesn't seem to do anything, so understandably I was a little confused. What does this guy want me to do, like pressing tabs? He said, try the next line. So I went down a line and then pressed tab, and he's like, oh, okay, that indented. And most of us who are familiar with tabs, like, no, they indent stuff. And this wasn't then like too shocking. It's just that if I press tab again, it doesn't indent anymore. And it turns out that this is because what tab is not doing is inserting a tab character to align things. It's instead running a function that is smartly trying to indent my code. So much so that I can just sort of scroll down here, typing tab on every line, and Emacs is going to take care of how far indented each line is supposed to be according to the syntax table that it understands is in effect for the C file. So this part was just like, damn, man, like the machine will do it for me. Like, that's great. That's what computers are supposed to do. They're supposed to work for you, not against you. And For anyone who has written code, they already know it's sort of a tough process, and anything you can get in terms of help from tooling like this is going to be super useful. Now, the fellow that told me to use Emacs didn't sort of mention the other facet of this, that this is actually a really dumb way to indent a file, that instead you might make use of further commands like I'll select a whole region of stuff and then enter a keystroke that will indent the entire region. It might be because he didn't have time, he had to answer C++ questions, or he didn't know about this. But over the years, I became acquainted with these various features, and they're sort of a black art. Like, they're not encoded in a readily consumable and dense source like a good video on this. So it's my goal then to try and get through some of this stuff so that you guys can make use of this in your own dealings. I would not expect that after our session together you come away being very good at Emacs editing, but hopefully with some practice, you will come to get better at it. I think of it less like a text editor and more like a piano or another musical instrument that you have to learn to play. And while piano at first seems very unwelcoming in that you press notes and nothing good seems to come out, with practice and diligence, you get better and you can make beautiful things. Such is the nature of Emacs here that we're hoping to impress upon folks. Good so far? Okay, cool. So let me back up to the slides that we're looking at a moment again. I guess I say slides, they're not really slides. Like, this will be just a text document. And you can see part of the power of Emacs is it can do a lot of things with text. It is why it's been referred to as the 100-year editor, as in the editor that 100 years from now will still be around and still be relevant because it's designed to grow. And one of the things that we'll focus on then is why is it able to grow so. That'll have more to do with its customization and tailoring, so things we'll talk about in the next session. But you'll get a taste of it here, but at any rate. So the first thing you should know about Emacs is that it is really old. It was introduced in the early sort of phase of computing, and it was it came out of some AI labs and several people responsible for it, notably Richard Stallman, who's part of the Free Software Foundation, was associated with it. You can study history later and find out it was sort of branched and remerged and various other things. But part of the reason I mentioned history is that it gives a context for why things are so awkward in Emacs with respect to other modern stuff. For instance, by default, you're looking at an Emacs that is not graphically very pretty. If you start up your standard Emacs, and I'll do so over here, I'll have to quit Vim first, which is its own sort of task on that front. I'll start up Emacs without any sort of initializations, and you can see it's got sort of clunky looking text. It's got, menus, but they're not sort of great. They're sort of haphazardly arranged, and there are all sorts of strangeness here. And this is because Emacs grew up in an age when there were no graphics. Everything was just a terminal. To that end, most of the stuff is going to be very text-based, and since there was no mouse at that point, it's also very keyboard-focused, that anything you can and most of the things you want to do in Emacs will be done just by keeping your hands on the home row and moving around. This also explains to some extent this second point down here as to why things look a little different in Emacs. It wasn't until 1984 when IBM copied Apple's stuff and they all agreed Control-C is going to be copy, Control-X is going to be cut, Control-V is going to be paste, that those things became sort of standardized and enshrined and users began to expect them. On the other hand, Emacs was born some 8 years before, and it already decided, like, oh, we're going to copy things with by pressing MetaW. And for those unfamiliar, Meta is usually going to be an Alt button on your Windows machines, at least. Control-W will be called killing stuff, which is equivalent to the modern cut, and Control-Y is to yank, which is more or less to paste with a few special sauces in there. So since it grew up before any of the modern conventions and has persisted into the present day, this explains to some extent why things are all named funky things like cut and kill and so forth versus their modern equivalences. We'll try to draw some of those equivalences as we go forwards. The final part is actually a boon in that because Emacs grew up in this non-graphical area, it's very easy to run almost an identical version of Emacs in the terminal. So this means if all you have is an SSH login to another machine, you can fire up Emacs in there and get basically the same experience that you would with a graphical version. This is presuming, of course, that it's more or less the same version of Emacs and you can get most of your tailoring and customization over there. But it's a real nice part when you can, in the terminal itself, do a Emacs no window and see more or less the same set of stuff. For example, here in the terminal only is the set of stuff that we're looking at right now. So this is a non-graphical sort of display with terminal, and you can see I've got most of the same stuff happening so far. Good? Cool. So in its early life, Emacs was considered this really heavyweight thing. One of the monikers, I mean, Emacs itself is sort of an acronym for editor macros, but folks on the other side of the Great Divide, VI users used to call it 8 megabytes and constantly swapping. Now, those of you who are young will probably not take this as much of a dig because 8 megabytes is pretty small for a program running right now. But when you only had like 1 megabyte of main memory back in the day, apparently this is like a big deal and it would run really slow. But nowadays, like it doesn't really matter because your standard Atom or VS Code is going to take like a gig of memory to run. So Emacs is lightweight in comparison. One of the reasons that it is somewhat more heavyweight than its brethren it took this very interesting approach of incorporating a programming language interpreter into it. And since the folks who were working on it were AI folks and Lisp had this association with AI in the early days, it is the case that Emacs has a built-in Lisp interpreter. This is the source of its great power, is that anything you can do is essentially done via running Lisp code, and you can easily add on to the Lisp code that Emacs understands to tailor it and to customize it. Again, things we'll talk about at a later point, but this is what makes it fun to use, in that if you don't like the way something works, you can change it, and the changing barrier is fairly low, so you can tweak things in various ways. So with that in mind then, I'm about to dive into some of the sort of actual details of editing quickly and the conventions that Emacs uses. But I want to take a moment just to ask if there are questions or discussion points to hear. Up front, sir.
What does constantly swapping mean?
So you're actually in the machine architecture course that I'm teaching. And so we'll discuss this later. If you run out of RAM, main memory, then traditionally you start using disk space for main memory. And the act of taking part of main memory and copying it into disk, this is called swapping, so that you can sort of free up memory to do something else without losing the stuff that you had before. It's a slow process. And if you're constantly swapping, this means your program is probably spending a lot of time but not getting a lot of work done. So this was a dig at Emacs for that. It's a good term to be aware of just generally as computer science, and we might hit a few other such terms as we go forwards. Feel free to ask as you come forward. I have a question for you. Put your hand in the air if you're in the room and you actually have Emacs installed and you can do something with it at the moment. It's just about all of you. It's not required, but I would encourage you, if you don't have it yourself, maybe slide over to a neighbor that has it and see what they're doing. So let's get started with some conventions here. So we'll want to talk a little bit about appearance first, because Emacs conventions don't necessarily follow what is present in your modern editors. For that, I want to open up a picture. Actually, no, I don't need to open a picture. I can just come over to this default instance here. Actually, no, I'm gonna pull up the picture because I'll have them labeled, and I think it's worthwhile to see that stuff. So. In the figures, there's, let's see, this guy. We'll open up the ping version of this. So, I'm going to get up, and for the moment, I'm going to disable screen keys so that we can see the whole thing and come back to this. This will probably be the only time that I actually get up in terms of talking about this stuff. But your standard sort of layout as you would start it has as its main feature a buffer. And this is where most of the contents and action is actually going to happen. It's this center part of the screen, and we'll see, though, that you can divide that center part into a bunch of sort of split parts that display different pieces of information. Typically, up top, if you start at uninitialized, you got a menu bar, you got a toolbar. These are familiar things. The slightly weird-looking stuff down at the bottom is a fairly condensed version of a bunch of information that's pertinent to editing. First, this line here displays general information about what's happening in this buffer. You'll see a name over here, and by default, you'll have a scratch buffer, potentially others like but as we open things, this will correspond to like myfile.c or somefile.txt and so forth. You've got a line number. You've also got some modes, and this will be pertinent to whatever kind of stuff I'm editing. It might be C code, might be Java code, might be Python code. We'll probably display something about I'm in C mode, I'm in Java mode, I'm in Lisp mode in this case. There'll also probably be a few minor modes displayed over here that tweak subtly the behavior that you want. For instance, checking for spelling as you go over other stuff along those lines. This obtuse crap over here has to do with what's going on in terms of states. And you'll see this little spot over here pertains to whether or not the file that you're editing has been saved or not. Stars typically mean you haven't saved it, and blanks here don't. And the little U, like, I can't remember what that means actually, so it might be present in the next diagram that we'll look at in a second. But it's not a major concern at this juncture. The bottomest part down here will be referred to as the mini buffer. And in truth, it's a little spot that will edit text in as well occasionally. It's used mainly to give feedback, like something just happened, so it'll display a message down here. And it's also used to get input. For instance, some of the commands we'll end up running will ask, please enter something, and that prompt will always be down here. You have no idea how beautiful it's going to be when you get used to this, and how ugly it's going to be when you have pop-ups that ask for information and steal the focus of your cursor all the time. Once you get used to this thing and it being sort of this pervasive, ever-present, and if I need to interact in some way, it happens down here, you'll start to hate like all the other ways that there are to interact because they seem sort of obtuse and invasive and just generally sort of bad in that front. But initially, it's going to seem like stupid. It's like I type something, I'm not sure what's happening, but eventually you're trained to like look down here. It's like, oh, this is what happened, and something's being prompted for me down here in the mini buffer. Clear on terms? Got buffer. You've got the mode line, and you've got the mini buffer. Very shortly, we're going to get rid of all these things because I haven't used them in 15 or so years, and so don't know much about them, so can't comment on them. But for beginners, feel free to keep them open. In terms of myself, my preferred way of interacting with Emacs looks more along the following lines. I may have to move in on these things just a little bit. So this is a documented version of 2 frames of Emacs. They're both the same session, but you can see a window over here and a window over here, both displaying Emacs and both managed by the same Emacs. You can see my color preferences are quite different than what the default are, and this is one of the beautiful parts of Emacs. Like most modern editors, you can establish whatever coloring scheme you want and sort of tweak that endlessly, as you were. But you can see then some of the things that are interesting. For instance, up here, I have one buffer, and down here, I have a second buffer. And internally, this is what Emacs refers to as windows, as in this is a frame, this entire thing. It's split into a top and a bottom window over here. This one up top is editing some C code. This one down in the bottom is demonstrating some errors that resulted from attempting to compile. You can see then the mode up here is C code for this guy. Down here is compilation mode, as in displaying the results of some compile that I did. They happen to be related in that I tried to compile this C code, and this is the results of that compilation. You see an error here. We'll talk about how that particular facet of things works later. But importantly, I might be able to fix this problem just by saving the file that I have over here. The little stars here indicate I haven't saved age.c anytime recently. Good so far? Yep. Right-hand side, you can see the splitting can go in more than one direction. I've got a top frame, or a top window rather, and then two bottom windows, left and right over here. And this shows a few other things that are sort of interesting to look at and previews of things to come. Up top is a window for editing Lisp code. And you can see the Emacs Lisp. It has its own little variant of Lisp that's understood and how you program it internally. Of course, as text editors ought to, you have proper syntax highlighting both for Lisp code and for C code down here. But in addition to editing code and compiling it, you can also interact with a variety of other things on the computing system this way. In the lower left is a shell, as in this particular buffer doesn't correspond to a file at all, and it corresponds to a process. I started a shell, and I'm typing little commands like ls and date and cd and so forth. I got my little prompt here, and just generally this stuff acts more or less like a terminal would. But it's all within the purvey of Emacs, and we'll see it's terribly useful to be able to treat this stuff as text as well, particularly if you want to copy something in here. There's no mouse movement. It's just standard text editing stuff. And finally, in the lower right, I think my personal favorite is the directory editor, as in you'll be able to open not just files, not interact with processes, but also look at folders and interact with those in Emacs. At times, just do standard folder stuff like navigate or open files. Other times, do really crazy stuff like treat this entire thing as text, and as I put a different name up here, it will automatically rename the file associated with it. So this gives a general sense of what the possibilities are. That little thing that I said I forgot, well, it has to do to some extent with whether or not this buffer corresponds to a file. The U down here means it doesn't correspond to a file. This corresponds to a process, to a directory. The dashes over here indicate it actually corresponds to a file. In this case, my customization file for Emacs or a C file over here. Feeling good so far? Questions about what you see? Anything sort of bewildering? Yeah, sir.
What are the lower right symbols up next to the U for the lower right window?
Like this one right here?
Yep.
The little percents down there are going to indicate that it's a read-only directory. Or at least right now, this is in read-only mode. You can open files, for instance, in read-only mode if you don't want to edit them, you just want to look at them, and this will prevent any inadvertent changes to it. And by default, you can't change the text in this directory because it's marked as read-only. We'll see later on how you can change to edit things in here and then save those changes in the form of like file renames instead. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. Anything else? All right, then let's get to the editing. Talk about this stuff. Emacs takes the approach that most modern editors do, and that it's a modeless text editor. That means you are constantly sort of, as you're typing, like giving direct input to the editor. Now I'm going to contrast this just a little bit, to make that sort of apparent. In Emacs, if I type A, like, oh, and I'll bring this up quick. That screen key. Cool. When I type A, like I see A's on the screen. Now this is in contrast to the other standard Unix editor, VI, which is a so-called modal editor. That at any given time, VI is either in a sort of, what do they call it? A command mode in which the keys that you type actually do commands instead of inserting characters. But then you can switch into editing mode where as I type A, it actually see A. This sort of hurdle to overcome in VI is part of the reason a lot of people like freak out and just like leave it. But it's actually a source of great power in that a lot of times as you're working with various kinds of texts, you don't need to enter anything, you just need to navigate very fast. And so there's this convention in VI of having H, J, K, and L sort of navigate to the left, down, up, and to the right. And you'll see that in various spots as speedy navigation techniques. But that only works if you're in this command mode, as it were, because then the key bindings, as you would type H, J, K, and L, move you around. I suppose I should demonstrate that just quick. I know we aren't talking about VI, but it's worth saying. So So here's a random text file, and as I type J now, you can see my cursor is going down. As I type K, I'm going back up, and L and H like moving around. It's only at the stage that I press I that I'm in insert mode, and as I type J now, I'm actually seeing characters in there. Usually toggle out of that command mode by pressing escape, and at this point I've totally clobbered a very important file to me, so I'm going to quit without saving because I don't want that save stuff to be done. Now, it's the case that Emacs also adopts this approach of using commands internally. The big difference is going to be that anytime you press a button in command, press any key on the keyboard or press a so-called chord like Control X, this is actually running a command that's looked up on the fly. And so as I type, A down here, A, this is actually running a self-insertion command, which is bound to most of your standard sort of alphabetic and numeric keys. It's like, oh, take this key and actually insert it right away. Versus, as I press something like Control P, this is running a command that's to go to the previous line, or Control N to go to the next line. Control L will sort of recenter the screen, either to the top or the bottom or to the middle, depending on how many times I press it, and so forth. It's the case then that you can always look up at various times, like when I press this key, what command is going to get run, and show me some documentation on that. There are a few basic pieces of terminology and shorthands that I think I'll mention, but the primary sort of thing that Emacs modes do are to, when I'm in C mode, to set these key bindings so they're appropriate to C, so that pressing this or that command will do something that's C appropriate, versus if I'm editing a list file, or I'm in a shell, or I'm editing a directory, pressing that same key might do something different that is more appropriate to that kind of thing. We'll look at some major modes in the future, but just to get an idea of what those keystrokes look like, you'll have to understand a few conventions and shorthands. If you see something that looks like this, Control or a C-W, this is Emacs shorthand for holding the Control key and pressing W. If Joe wouldn't mind zooming in my hands for just a second, you'd see that with holding Control down here and W over here, and you can see that did something sort of dramatic, like a bunch of text disappeared. And holding Control down over here, I think, yeah, and pressing another key will cause an undo in this case. So that C dash is short for hold Control and do something. Most of you are probably accustomed to this because you're accustomed to like Control O to open a file, or Control S to save files, and so forth. And unfortunately, none of those standard bindings are going to work in Emacs. It has different ways of doing all that stuff. The M here is short for meta. Now, the history of this is a little unclear to me, but I believe it's the case that the early AI labs, where Emacs was first sort of stitched together, didn't have alt keys, or at least they had a meta key as well, and this became the sort of favored thing. If you zoom in, it would have been around where the alt, or like the Windows key, is on the keyboard these days. But depending on your platform, this could be on Windows, probably the alt key. So typing, for instance, Alt F does something. In this case, it moves forward a word. But in Apple land, you might actually have to hold that weird-looking Apple key, or it has the little like curly Q things on it. It depends a lot like where you're at, because if you have an alt key on a Mac, it might do something entirely different. This also might vary a little bit on whether you're in a GUI mode like this or running Emacs in a terminal as to which key corresponds to it. Control is fairly reliable, but Alt/Meta is a little weird. So based on your platform, you just have to figure out which is my meta key and then associate with that. Finally, then, you'll see commands listed, or the key bindings associated with them, like the following, that there's a Control X and then B. So you'll see prefixes in Emacs often. Control X is by far the most common. And this is press Control, and then, hold Control, then press X. And then you'll see down here in the mini buffer, down over here, it's waiting for you to press something else, and that's because Control X itself doesn't run a command. It's sort of a two-step bit of business. So if I try B right now, then I'll see something semi-interesting, that down here the mini buffer is asking what buffer would you like to open, because that chord, that keystroke of Control X followed by B, is bound to the command you want to change to a different buffer and zip over to that. So if I could, just press Enter at this point, this figs is shown. So this will change me over to a different buffer. In this case, one that's editing a directory. So those two conventions of control, meta, and then chords involving those things like Control X followed by B. Those will be important as we work our way through. So if you want to try these at home, you at least know this is the key I'm actually supposed to press. And hopefully I'll go slow enough up here to see the Control X followed by B so you can actually see it on the little display down here. Good so far? Okay. There are a few other things to mention. I'll mention this now. There's one special invocation that you'll see used often. It's this MetaX business. This is going to pull up a little prompt down here, which is at the bottom of the screen to run an interactive command of some kind. The key bindings that we're typing, like Control F and Control P and Control X followed by B, all of those run some Lisp function that does something. That is a named Lisp function, so I could instead just type the name of it down here to get that. For instance, forward word, and this will have tab completion as well, so if you get most of it right, as the Unix shell does, you can type there. And you can see up here this sort of ghosted cursor, which is called the point. After I press Enter here, it's going to move forwards one word, and if I do that again, it'll move forwards another word. So this will be another way in this little mini buffer to execute commands that I don't remember what the key binding is for it, but I do remember the name of that. Oh yeah, Joe, what's up?
Is Tetris still a command that you could run?
It is. In fact, when you really want to waste time, you can type MetaX Tetris and then go to town on it. I have a bad habit of doing this when I should be working on projects to release for students, so I'll quit out of it now. And I didn't actually get a high score in this case. So. All right, so cool. He talks about like, oh, I don't know much about Emacs, but he learned that one pretty fast because it's very, very important there. Finally then, the other one that you'll see occasionally is this meta with a colon. And in terms of striking, this is hold the Alt key on Windows boxes. You'll have to hold Shift as well because you all know you need to press Shift to get the character above semicolon, which is the colon, and then press colon here. This will give you a little prompt here to evaluate Lisp code in the raw, which you can do to execute various functions that aren't necessarily interactive, but that's more of a customization issue that we'll get to later. So a few important commands that I want to mention right off the bat. These keystrokes, they will show up and I'll make use of them fairly frequently. You'll see commands for movement. Representative of that is like Control F to move forwards by one. Control G, I think, is the one that I want you all to remember. Put a bullet or a star next to this one. This is a universal cancel. So if you get in trouble, like you press Control X and like I don't know what to do next, you press Control G to cancel. And this will get you out of trouble if you're in trouble in some way. Example, I didn't actually want to change a buffer down here, so I'll press Control G to quit out of it, to cancel. You'll see then if you want to open up files, Control X, Control F will give you a prompt to say open up a file. So if I wanted to look at this other file down here, I can open that thing up. And then there's sort of various invocations of these things that we'll talk about in more detail as we go forwards. So this table exemplifies then some of the abbreviations that we're going to use as we move forwards through the rest of the tutorial. Any questions about what you see here in terms of Control Fs or Meta X's or anything along those lines that is confusing at this point? Not so much. Feeling good. Okay. I don't think, I think this is just sort of redundancy to mention again that when I press Control F, I'm actually running some sort of a command. And there'll be a couple ways to do that, either by naming the command with a meta X or typing in a raw Lisp command. The Lisp stuff that's over here will become more important if you want to tailor more thoroughly, because you'll do that by writing Lisp code in the customization files that are associated with Emacs. Eventually, though, you'll sort of memorize a lot of these and have them at your disposal. Up to that point, you'll probably have to look up things quite a bit. We'll start our proper editing discussion with a discussion of movement. And this seems kind of dumb until you realize that a lot of what you do when you're editing text is moving the cursor around to get it positioned at the right spots. I found a bug in my code. I need to get to that spot relatively quickly. Emacs provides a huge array of movement commands that are sort of bound to short sets of keys and chords. And so it's worth knowing about a bunch of those. It's kind of daunting at the beginning of it. You might wonder, how am I ever going to learn all of these, and why would I ever want to learn them? Could cram all this knowledge into my brain? It's sort of like practicing scales when it comes to piano. It's like people practice scales to train their hands to do the right thing when it comes to actual music. So I wouldn't suggest that you go home and practice pressing Control F over and over and over again, or Control B to go backwards over and over again. I just suggest that before every time you reach your hand over off the home row to your arrow keys, that you take a moment to pause if you're trying to learn Emacs and say, how do I do that without taking my hands off the home row? And to move left and right, it'll be Control F to go forwards, Control B to go backwards, Control N to go down a line, and Control P to go up lines. So those seem like they're sort of innocuous, like why wouldn't I just use the arrows? That seems more direct, until you start to realize, it takes like a quarter second or so to move your hand over to the arrows, and then another quarter second to move it back to the home row. Over a lifetime, that's several days worth of time that you'll have saved by now. And if that seems dumb, then you should probably leave now, because a lot of what we're going to talk about as we go forwards is just time savings and making it easier on yourself. To that end, let's take a look at a few other basic movement commands. So I mentioned down here that Control F, Control B, and Control N and Control P move up and down, left and right, and so forth. Emacs has a number of commands that will move you further than that. Example, the Control F moves a character forwards, but Meta F will move you forwards by a word. This is white space sensitive and also somewhat contextual. So if you're in a major mode that has some weird kind of word, then you can set this up to move forwards words. For instance, I believe it's the case in Java mode where you have these camel case conventions. You have some variable name like this. Normal text mode, a Meta F will move forwards a whole word. But in Java mode, you can move forwards by just the sum here instead, which is handy. That will translate also then to making deletions and so forth, where you can eliminate this middle word fairly easily. So aside from word movement, there are also a bunch of line movements. Example, if you're in the middle someplace, for instance over here, you want to move to the beginning line, that's a Control A, and Control E will move you to the end of the line. And we've already seen then the Control P and Control N moves you up and down lines along those. If you're looking carefully, and I think now's a good time, Joe, if you could zoom in on the hands, you'll see there's very little movement then in terms of where my fingers are going in order to zip around along these lines. And this is because I've trained for quite a while to try to get some semblance of touch typing and minimal movement of my fingers, keep them close to the home row in order to get the text or the cursor positioned in the right spot. One final reason that you might be interested in these set of commands, these sort of first initial pass that are control, is they're all default bindings in your standard shell as well. If I jump over here to a shell, let's see, actually I'll need a different shell, like this one, and I type some stuff on the shell and press something like Meta B, you'll notice I'm jumping backwards by single words, and Control F will move me forwards by a character, Control E to the end, Control A to the end. And it'll turn out that a bunch of the Emacs editing commands like Control K also work in your standard shell. This is because the readline stuff that the shell uses is based around Emacs bindings. You can tailor this if you're a VI user, and so change them all to VI kinds of stuff, but they'll make your shell unusable to other people then, so do it at your own risk, as it were. In terms of history then, we saw that Control P moves up a line on the shell. This moves up in history, so I can move up and down in history. This is what your standard arrows do, so it's good to recall stuff there. We'll see a few other tricks too, like you can search backwards through history fairly quickly using Emacs Keybindings. Let's see, jumping over here. Oh yeah, so we left off this. Questions at this point? You guys are like very tired looking and need some coffee or something. But I guess this is fairly mundane. I didn't expect there to be a sort of lot of a hubbub around this. No questions? Feeling good? Okay, cool. Aside from that, when you're editing actual text, there may be some notion of a sentence that you want to move around on. Let's see, I think I'll have to jump over to an actual text file for this. So I took some notes on various things. Some of these have sentences like periods in them. Control E will move to the ends of sentences. Meta E ends of sentence, meta A, beginnings of sentences, so you can move around fairly quickly along those lines. And there are also sort of structural commands that you can move forwards, paragraphs, for instance, with meta, let's see, it's closing curly and backwards a paragraph with meta opening curly. Now, the notion of a paragraph in a sentence is a little weird, and so you may find that this has some play in when you're editing a text file, but less play when you're editing a C file. I just generally remember that these things jump farther than sort of moving by sentences or moving by words would. And this can then be used as a navigation mechanism to move a little bit farther forwards than you would normally. The last couple that I mentioned here come up every so often. You might want to jump to the end of the file, and this will be meta caret, so sort of meta right caret or meta greater than. You hold Alt, hold Shift, and then press the period key, which you get that one. And if you want to jump back to the beginning, it's the opposite one, so you can jump around fairly fast on that front. So lots of movement commands, and getting accustomed to not taking your hands off the home row allows you to do sort of fairly sophisticated things like I want to get down to this little modes guy down here. And so to that end, I'll maybe take a couple passes at here and then move forwards with an Alt F, and this gets me positioned pretty quickly along that. In addition to the sort of raw text stuff that's mentioned up here, Emacs also has a number of structural sort of movement stuff. For this, I think it's worthwhile to open up some actual code, because this pertains more to codey kinds of stuff. To that end, let me pull up that C file that I had just a moment ago. You'll notice here that I have this little if statement, and it has some open and close parentheses and an open and close say curly braces. If you want to move beyond these or around them, hold Control and then meta, and then B to go backwards, F to go forwards over a parenthesized expression. This will work for any kind of brace, square, curly, round, etc., and generally sort of jumps over words too as you move forwards. This will allow you to navigate functions fairly easily then as well. And if you're in the midst of something and want to move up a level, then Control meta U, I think, goes up a level on that front in case you're deeply nested. Example, let's see. Here within this stuff, I'm nested in one set of parentheses. Control U will move me up one, and that's nested inside of a function, so that'll be, or sorry, an if, and then up one more level to the function that encapsulates it. When I was first starting out on some of this Emacs basic stuff, I saw there was a lot of sex involved. This isn't actually, sex P. It's although I think it's pronounced that, it's an S expression, which is an old Lisp term for stuff that's in between parentheses. So bear in mind that this is a PG-13 program, but you'll see a few naughty words used here and there. Finally, within certain files, there's more structure that has sort of an outline kind of format. And you notice like these guys up here, they look like outlines, and I can move between them using certain key bindings. I prefer MetaN and MetaP in outline stuff to sort of jump around between headings along those lines. We'll see that this has some use in org mode, which is one of Emacs's sort of killer features, and this makes movement around to various note-taking stuff much easier than it would be otherwise. Good so far? Okay. What you'll find yourself using is, if you forget a lot of the movement stuff, here's the one to remember. And it is Control-S, which, unlike every other modern editor, does not save. Instead, it starts a search. And this might sort of harken from the fact that disks were slow when Emacs was born, but searching within memory was much faster. So why spend a key binding that's prominent, like a Control-S, on something that's slow versus you're much more commonly searching for things in a file that you already have open. Now, what's weird about a search is that as I press Control-S, you'll see a change, although here you'll have to have trained yourself to Emacs conventions. As I press Control-S, where do you see a change up here that's worthy of note? Yeah, no cards, but this gentleman in the back, I want you to say it, sir.
Oh, there's a search input at the bottom?
Yeah, down here in the mini buffer, where we'll do a lot of our sort of interaction with Emacs, there's now a prompt, and it says iSearch, short for interactive search. As you would type characters now, like START, you can see the cursor has moved in the purple up here to this spot that's the first match, but we've also gotten highlighting for all of the other matches that are there. If I want to toggle between the starts here, then it's just a matter of, at this point, pressing Control-S to go to the next one, Control-S to go to the next one, Control-S to the next one. Control-R starts a reverse search, or if I'm in the middle of one, we'll go backwards to the previous searches that I found. This turns out to be a super useful navigation technique because it will position the cursor and has very minimal overhead in terms of setup. So suppose I wanted to get down to this cancel thing. There are an elaborate set of movements that I could make use of with Control-Ns and Alt-Fs and so forth. Or I could just say search for cancel, and voila, I'm positioned properly. Once you get to where you want, press Enter. Or if you search for something and decide, ooh, I didn't actually want to be there, that universal cancel, Control-G, will plop you back to wherever your search started. So far, so good? Okay. Just to sort of recap that, because it flew by fast, to get up to that searching that was behind me up here, I started a Control-R. And that will do an interactive search, but you can see the prompt down here, it has a backwards notation. So rather than going forwards, this will go backwards. And then the Control-G cancels that, so I end up back where I was. Now, these are raw text, and Emacs's convention is not to be case sensitive unless you start typing cases. So for instance, if I'm down here and I start a reverse search for the word search, you'll see both the uncapitalized and the capitalized ones are highlighted. On the other hand, if I start typing for capital SEARCH, since I used alternate case here, Emacs is going to start honoring that case, as in, ooh, you wanted a capital first and then lowercase, I'll match that exactly up here. Generally, I don't care too much about this, although there are a few cases. If, for instance, I were to type for a search for just all search, you can see I'm starting to get a failure to say, like, I can't find this, and that's because there is no search, capitalized search, anywhere in the document. Last part of this that's interesting, as I search for a word, like I'll say interactive in this case, I can scroll forwards, but eventually if you get to the bottom of some file, you'll see a failure. Continuing to press Control-S will wrap around back up to the top so you can cycle through the entire buffer over and over again, looking at the different instances of various words that you're looking for. I want to emphasize that the philosophy behind this, I think, demonstrates a number of things in Emacs that are interesting. First, again, it's much more common to search for something within a text file as you're working than it is to save the text file. And so this is right on the home roll. Control-S is an easy key binding to get to. Second, there's no pop-up, no sort of windows that interfere with you being able to see the information that's pertinent to you, what's going on. All of the interaction part of this happens down here. And third, then, it demonstrates a couple things about once you start a search, pressing the same key does something slightly different. That as I press Control S the first time, I can start typing stuff like regular. And if I press Control S again, it will continue that search, sort of looking around on those lines. So to that end, there is sort of maximal display of interaction or information that might be pertinent to you, and minimal sort of interference of pop-up or GUI kinds of things that might get in the way. You'll see that philosophy demonstrated throughout the sort of Emacs menagerie of stuff. So come to expect it. Making sense? Okay. For those of you who are familiar with regular expressions, I am sorry, they're awful, but they are useful. And so there are regular expression versions of those searching things. You'll start to notice a pattern of like if I type more things with more modifiers, I start to get sort of more deep effects. So holding Control S gets me a standard text search. If I hold Control and Meta S, I get a regular expression search. And this allows me to search for things there where the exact characters I'm typing, some of them that are special might be interpreted specially. Those that know something about regular expressions, you know, the $sign means something special. It means match against the end of a line. So if I type something like N and then dollar now, I get not all N's, but only N's that sort of end a line. And then similar semantics of give me all the end of line stuff that's over here. And those that are familiar with regular expressions know that square braces are interpreted specially in most cases as any one of these three characters. So if I do a search for SMT, and you can note down here, Emacs can't comply yet because I haven't closed that set of characters that I'm looking for. Then once I do, it'll start saying, oh, there's a capital M, there's a capital M, there's a capital M and a T and an S and a capital S and so forth, skipping all the other stuff that's in there. Making sense? If you don't know anything about regular expressions, don't worry about it. Just don't use that one yet. And Emacs's dialect of regular expressions leaves a little bit to be wanting. You'll find yourself putting in 2 or 3 backslashes in a lot of cases to get its interpreter to sort of comply with special stuff like white space and printing characters and so forth. But if none of that makes any sense to you, don't worry about it at this point. Good so far? Cool. All right. So there comes a time when you want to go to a specific spot in a file that you know a priori some information about it. And for that, all sensible text editors, VIs, and Emacs, and included in that, give you a way to do this. There used to be not a good key binding for this, but they added at some point this MetaG, which is a shorthand for go someplace. And then just G again will prompt for a line number. So if I wanted to go to line 300, just type it down here, and you can see again the mini buffer interactions. If I press enter at this point, I'll jump to line 300. As evidenced down here with the little 300, actually I'll point here, the line 300 over here. I have this set up to show columns too, but that's not the default. If I wanted to go to line 320 instead, then I can do that just fine as well. What will be more pertinent is these MetaG businesses to jump to next and previous errors that are tied up with, I compiled some code. Emacs understands the output of that compilation because it understands like what GCC puts out for error messages. You have a syntax at line 32. You have some unclosed parenthesis at line 67. And these we'll use in a moment as shorthand to jump to those specific error locations, which is going to make patching code to get it syntactically correct a lot more palatable than it would be otherwise. But every now and then you would just want to go to a certain line, and here you have that go-to line. There are various other things that we don't have a lot of time to discuss, like bookmarking certain spots in files, or even saving certain files in a register that you can jump instantly to them. I have all kinds of these sort of tweaks like set in because if I wanted to edit like my bash RC file, which is the initialization file for the shell, I have a little keyboard shortcut set up so that I can jump to a particular register. B holds the bash RC, and it's even sort of coming up with, here are the places that you can jump. So B to jump to bash RC. I tend to collect quotes at times, so I have this long collection of quotes that various famous people or not famous people have said. Oh, I should probably have, this is supposed to be PG, so you can look at it later on. At any rate, so those things we don't have a lot of time to talk about, but do prove useful in the long term, particularly if you're visiting one file over and over and over again, and you're tired of like typing in the sequence to sort of find it on the file system. There are ways to shorten that and search them out yourself, discussions of registers and bookmarks and so forth. But this is about text editing, and we haven't actually edited any text yet, so it's probably an hour in. High time we get to that point. Few bits of terminology. This thing that's moving around, that's in black right now, it's referred to in Emacs as the point. And the reason I raise that now rather than the cursor is that you'll see all of the documentation associated with editing functions refer to the point and the mark. And the point is the thing that you can actually move and see. When you would start Emacs up sort of normally, as is the case down over here, this thing blinks incessantly. So I will encourage you all to run the following command. It starts with MetaX because there isn't a short key binding for it. It's called cursor blink, let's see, a blink cursor mode rather, which will disable that blinking and keep you from going insane from the constant sort of pounding there. Now some of you might like that, and so don't run this, but don't be surprised if I'm sending out your Emacs that if I require that you do it, because I lived for years without with blinking cursors, and it almost caused me physical harm. The mark, on the other hand, is this invisible little bit that gets placed in the Emacs buffers and has semi-mysterious effects. The thing that I'll mention that comes to commands is you can plop the mark down someplace by pressing Control Space. So I'll do that now. And a little bit of feedback down here in the mini buffer. Down over here, you can see the mark has been set. Now, it doesn't seem to have any real visceral sorts of effects so far. I've actually created now a new region that spans from wherever my cursor is now to wherever I plop that mark down. You can check this with the key binding Control X, which will switch between the mark and the point. So this is essentially equivalent to when you have a standard text editor, what you've highlighted, for instance, with the mouse or by holding things. This is sort of used in Emacs, like if you hold the mouse button, you can highlight things along these lines, which also manipulate the mark and the point. But that's a pervasive sort of element, that the mark is always someplace and the point is always someplace, and the region that's in between it is oftentimes going to be the subject to editing effects, things that we'll get to in just a second. One interesting thing that you can do with just that facility is to put the mark in a bunch of places. So I'll put it right here at this text manipulation part, right here next to this between part, and then plop it down here at this at the end of cork here. If you press the sequence Control U, Control Space, this C space business usually would plop the mark someplace, but it's modified by this Control U business. We'll see that's a universal argument. And this actually pops off the mark chain so I can go back to positions that I had moments ago. It's a cheap way of bookmarking certain spots. Like, I'm pretty sure I'm going to need to come back here in a second, but meanwhile, I'm going to go down here. So I'll plop the mark down and then search for something like a modern. And like, okay, I've done my thing down here. Control U and space gets me back to where it was a moment ago. So to further underscoring the efficiencies that you get here, it turns out a lot of commands, for instance, searching, here's region, automatically do this for you, that when you start a search, the mark is plopped down wherever you're starting the search, so you can jump back there fairly quickly if you like. This is also going to come in handy as we get to start actually changing text. So a few bits more of terminology. These came up at the beginning, but they're now immediately relevant. You're familiar with cutting text, usually what you press Control X to sort of get rid of text. This is going to be referred to as killing in Emacs. And for those historical reasons that Emacs preceded the sort of standard terminology of cut, there's this different name for it. On the other hand, pasting, what you're familiar with, will be referred to as yanking, and there are all kinds of yank commands, mostly associated with Control Y to yank out. And there isn't a short name for copying, but you can take text that you were going to cut and instead just make a copy of it and plop it down where killed text usually goes. This place called the kill ring, which is responsible for saving all the stuff that you're killing in various buffers. It's similar in many ways to having sort of multiple cut or multiple clipboards that you're acquainted with in maybe advanced text editors. We'll see that in just a second. For the moment, I want to get up an actual text file that we can edit with sort of without fear and demonstrate some of these commands. I'm going to introduce some splitting here so we can look at that. And I'm just going to plop down, let's see, we'll just find ourselves a file like temporary.txt. Here is some text. Well, I should probably spell that right. Yet more stuff. And then that lorem ipsum whatever, along those lines. So here we've got a standard text file. If you are at the beginning of a line or in the middle of a line, the first and most common way to kill text is just press Control-K, which will get rid of the stuff up to the end of the line. If you want to get it back, you can undo, and we'll see, and you can see it floating down here. Control / undoes stuff. But the more common thing to do is, okay, I want to move this line down. I'll kill it along with the new line associated with it. I'll move to the end of the buffer, and I'll press Control-Y to yank it out, which will get me back what I had before. I can do this with several different things. For instance, kill this guy, and kill this guy. All that's gone, but if I press Control-Y once, that gets me the most recent thing. Control-Y once, the most recent thing, but then Alt-Y to sort of recall something earlier in the history, and then Control-Y, Alt-Y gets me back earlier in the history. Everything I killed is saved, and I can restore it by issuing this correct sequence of Control-Ys followed by, I think it's here, Meta-Y rather, instead here, Meta-Y. And this will be Meta-Y along those lines. So that flies by fast, but is sort of worth noting because it enables you to copy or cut a bunch of stuff and then always be able to recall it. So you don't have to worry about, ooh, I want to copy or cut this thing, but I've already got something on the clipboard that I want. There's no worries about those things because it's always going to be stored someplace in the Emacs kill ring that you can recall it. And when in doubt, you can make use of the following long form command, browse kill ring. This will have the effect of, showing you viscerally, here's everything that you've ever copied or cut or killed more properly, including some significant stuff that we had down here, which I inadvertently copied most of the buffer into the kill ring. At this point, coming over here and pressing Y on this thing will, on this ghosted cursor over here, yank that stuff in. So you can see it comes back over here. You never have to worry about losing text in most cases because everything you kill is retained in some way, shape, or form. Of course, this has limits, like there's probably 1,000 or 10,000 entries in this thing before it starts being recycled, but for most practical purposes, you won't have to worry on that front. Restore this thing. The other most common set of killing commands is to set the point someplace, for instance here, and then move forwards a little ways, and use Control-W, which will kill the region, just the stuff that's in between the cursor and that invisible mark that we set just a second ago. So then I can reposition that, and the next yank will plop the text that I had down over here. There are various ways that you can combine this stuff, but I think those three, killing a line, killing the region, and copying the region, as in I want to copy over here of these three words, and I'll yank them down here. Those, I think, are by far the most sort of useful, and they relate fairly directly to your standard cut, copy, and paste operations that you'd see, but they have slightly different names and bindings along those lines. How are we doing so far? Good? Okay. we introduced this notion of a kill ring, as in here's a whole bunch of stuff that you've killed previously, and then there are some various command invocations that allow you to cycle through, like bring this thing back, no, go farther into that ring, no, go farther into that ring. It's also the case that this undo business is also placed in a ring. So the sort of consequences of that are that you usually don't have to ever worry about losing some state of your buffer as you edit it. That it's always recallable via some sort of set of jamming the undo key binding. There are a couple of these in Emacs, but I prefer the control /. It's fairly close, and it's only one press on that front. So if I decide I didn't want to delete that word, whatever, it's just a control / to get it back. But if I decide I did want to delete it, I can just issue another command, like inserting a space, undo that, and then undo or redo the delete that I had before. And I decided, no, I actually didn't want to do that after all. I can recall that back and bring back the space that I had over here. The more times you press undo, the more things that you undo. But this is kept in a ring so that if I issue a new command, this gets pushed on the front, and then I can undo or redo the things that I did to get here at some point, so cycling back forwards. It's a little bewildering, and I don't have a good visualization for this. There actually are some Emacs add-ons that will show you like this tree of edits and allow you to sort of work your way through it. This is sort of like a Git management just for one buffer in the edits you've done to it. In my mind, that's sort of overkill, because in most cases, it's like, oh, I really didn't want to do what I just did. Like you just press space and then start undoing stuff to get back to wherever it was that, oh yeah, that looks about right. I'll continue forwards on that front. So between the sort of ability to kill as much as you want and to undo as far back as you want and redo it if you want, this provides a lot of safety mechanisms so that if you feel like you got into a bad state in the buffer, you can usually recover in some way to go backwards on that. Let's see. There's also a mention down here that control U business. You can undo multiple times, say undo 10 times here. This control U and then press, let's see, 10. The number is 1, 0, followed by a control undo. This passes then the numeric argument 10 to the undo command, which will do undo multiple times on that front. This can allow you to sort of jump backwards a lot farther in history than you would otherwise, although I don't use that particular feature too often. Yes, ma'am.
When you undo, like if you undid 10 times, would the other 9 things stay in the kill ring, or those disappear when you access it?
As far as I know, the kill ring functions independently from the undo history. So for example, if I kill this stuff and then press undo, it's back there, but it will still be in the kill ring. So now if I come down here and yank, I got the stuff that I killed. So the undoing doesn't affect that other thing where I'm storing text. It just affects what the buffer looks like right now. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Yeah, sir?
Is there like a maximum to the number of undos you can do?
I think so. The only time that I hit it is if I have some buffer that's open and then like some shell script is dumping information into it. And Emacs will usually detect like I've got this file open, but it's changed on disk, so I'll refresh it. And if that happens like 10,000 times, then you'll get some warning like, this has changed too many times. We're out of space in the undo ring. So for practical purposes, if you're editing normal files, you don't bump up against this too often. Make sense? Cool, okay. It's probably worth it just quickly to talk about this keyboard macro facility. Most editors of some sort or another allow you to say, start recording what I'm about to type, and then finish recording, and then replay what I just did. Emacs makes this particularly easy, but even if you don't adopt it wholeheartedly, I'd encourage you to explore how this is done in your VIs or your VS codes or your atoms and so forth, because it's a surprisingly useful feature that allows you to sort of quickly and cheaply program your editor to do something that you need on the fly. To set up a keyboard macro in Emacs, press Control X and then this open paren. That's sort of like I'm opening up a bunch of commands I'm going to type. It'll start recording whatever you do on the keyboard. It'll cancel out if you press Control G or something goes wrong. But supposing that doesn't happen, then pressing Control X and then the closing paren will stop recording and then save that stuff that you just typed as a sort of command that you can rerun multiple times. Getting a sense of like how this is potentially useful requires, I think, a concrete example. So I'm going to have a look in this directory survey results for just a second to demonstrate what this is potentially good for. This will be in the code directory that's associated with this. It's the case that every class that I teach, I ask for results at some point. And usually this is stored in some CSV file on a course management software like Canvas. I'll usually export that with a few sort of key things, which ends up giving me some text that looks like this. In it, there's some section for somebody reporting something along with some special characters I inserted to make it apparent like, oh, this is what their actual comment was. Now this is not easy on the eyes. It's sort of not, sort of turn around. You can see the spacing is all wonky. And one of the things that I commonly do is just convert this into a slightly more readable format. One way to do that is to make use of a keyboard macro. And this will demonstrate a number of things that we've seen so far. To start this, I'm going to start a keyboard macro. That's Control X and then the open paren. And you'll notice down towards the bottom then, Emacs is reporting in the mini buffer, you're defining something. So I'm going to record what you do. In this case, my goal is to get this in a sort of org mode friendly sort of format. And that means here I want to get rid of these little hashes because this is the actual comment. I'm going to put it below it and then treat this thing as a heading. So I'll start an interactive search for this along those lines and then press enter. So I'm stuck here. I want this to be on the next line, so I'll just press enter to move it down one. But crap, I screwed it up. Okay, because I don't want the sort of wrapping to happen. That's cool. I'm just going to undo that. And it's the case that when you screw up along those lines, call and undo, they'll stop recording the keyboard macro. So I'm going to retry that. And it's the case I don't want line wrapping. You can see this little thing down here called fill. And this is a minor mode that allows, as you type, they'll automatically sort of wrap text around to sort of get line breaks. You can set how far you want, like 80 columns or 50 columns or 20 columns of wrapping there. I'm going to disable that right now. I have a shortcut for that, but it's custom, so don't concern yourself too much. Let's try this again. Start the keyboard macro. That's that Control X open paren. Search for these three guys. That's good. Get rid of them. Press enter. Come back up to the previous line. Plop down a little asterisk here, and then stop the macro. At this point, Emacs has recorded what I just did, the set of keystrokes for that, and allows me to replay it with a Control X and then E, which will do the same thing to the next one. And if I press Control X, E, it'll search down here to the next one. In fact, I can just keep pressing E, and this will continue to sort of edit the text in the way that I had sort of initially designed. And there's also a, let's see, if I mark from here to the end, and then, let's see, apply key macro to region lines. It'll just run that macro to the end of the buffer, leaving me something like this. Now, right now, this has a little .txt extension to it. The file is called survey results parse.txt. You can see it's displayed as text, nothing special about that. But I can set up a different display if I say put this in org mode instead, in which case certain characters like this leading star are going to be displayed somewhat specially. And this puts me into a mode then where I have stuff that is reasonably nice to sort of look at, and it makes it visually more appealing to sort of separate along those lines. So two things in there then. The keyboard macro allowed me to do something quickly that is like, oh, I just need to type this and this. No, I screwed it up. Okay, let me type this and this. Okay, that's right. Just do that for the rest of the file. And that is super useful. And that's something that you couldn't describe with like a little command line text manipulation utility like sed or awk or something like that. Things we'll talk about in a later session. Things that are sort of hard to do in that way that you just want to sort of figure out in Emacs, you're going to record those and then replay them throughout a file. To make that even more sort of flexible, you can also take the keyboard macro that you just wrote and execute a series of commands that are mentioned down here to save that, to give it a name first, and then save it later on as actual Lisp code that can persist beyond this session of Emacs. So this is a cheap and easy way to add functionalities to Emacs that you might need in the future. I tend to recreate the magic every time, but if I were a little bit smarter and more disciplined, I'd probably record that macro, save it permanently, and then have it in my Emacs initialization. So every time I need to process one of those little feedback files, I can just run the macro on it instead of having to do this. Making sense? Again, this is not unique to Emacs. Chances are likely that whatever text editor you're using, if it's worth its salt, it has a similar facility, and it's worth knowing about it. The thing that makes Emacs sort of cool in that respect is that you can do all sorts of things to edit those keyboard macros after the fact. Example, command mentioned here, edit last keyboard macro. Edit last keyboard macro will actually pull up a buffer that says, here are the things that you did. And then you can actually plop some new stuff in there if you want to make interactive adjustments. And you'll notice that this just changed to a new buffer, and the changes that it would make here would affect that macro and be reflected back in it. It's also interesting because it's listing here are all of the commands that those key bindings actually correspond to. Control S is searching forward. I type this I business 3 times. That's the self-insert command. Control A, beginning of line, or the org equivalent of it, and so forth. So this is also a good way to just sort of see what is it that Emacs is doing as I'm pressing keys along those lines. Question here, sir.
I have 2 questions. One, how did you bring up that file explorer, like embedded within Emacs?
This one down here?
Yes.
Okay,
like,
so
or the
when
one
I'm
where it
typing,
like lists all the files on top of each other, or is that where you just
on top of each other? Okay, so there are a couple things you could be referring to. I'm going to get rid of this for the moment. Is it as I press Control X and then press B, this thing that you see down here?
It's
No.
like at
Okay.
the top of the screen, like all the files in your directory, and then you can
Sure. Okay. So like if I can press Control X and then D and ask me to edit a directory, this thing. Okay. Cool. We're going to talk about that in like, I think 3-4 minutes. So if you want to put a pin in that, like for just a second, this is called directory editor mode or DIRED mode, and it is another killer feature of Emacs. So it's worth talking about later. So I will talk about it, presuming we have time for it. Make sense? Cool. Okay. But that key binding, in case you're curious, just Control X and then D. This will ask you to edit a directory, and you can then punch in some directory, like here's my tool time directory, and lots of the same things that work in other text modes, like Control N and Control P work here. If I press Enter on this file, then I'll open up that file instead.
Is it like a multiple tab system too, where you can have like 2 windows open at the same time?
Indeed, there is, and we'll get there momentarily, I think. I mean, that's pretty much going to be the answer to anything. Can Emacs do this? Can Emacs do that? Almost 99% sure yes. Save for like, oh, I want to do intense graphical editing of this PDF or this JPEG image file. Like it does mainly text stuff on that front, but I'm sure someone somewhere has done something about like actual image editing using Emacs. It would be an interesting discussion there. Okay, so good. Okay, I'm going to blow through a few of these things, but it's worth to mention at least that your standard sort of editing features that go sort of forwards and backwards and kill things here, they aren't the only game in town. That a lot of modern editors have this notion of like, oh, I can put multiple cursors on, so every time I type things, like it will go along multiple lines at once. Emacs has had this for a long time, so you can do things like, for instance, eliminate this entire column of stuff to get rid of it, or add in, let's see, some stuff like here is some text that I want to appear in all lines. To that end, the rectangle commands I use in a lot of cases when you're doing some sort of picture kinds of editing. But there's also a whole mode for editing text pictures in Emacs, which is worth knowing about and dwelling on. But we just don't have enough time right now to sort of dwell into that. And there's a want to do the directory editing mode stuff. But the rectangle stuff is interesting and potentially useful. I mentioned this Control U thing that shows up all over the place and will modify the behavior of certain commands. Here's a handy one. You can press meta exclamation mark, and that would be hold Alt, hold Shift, and then press 1 to get the meta. And you'll see a prompt for a shell command down here, like ls. The results of this will be usually displayed in a separate buffer, but if I happen to want them in my current buffer and didn't feel sort of up to the task of changing over to this other window and copying that stuff, you can modify the behavior by instead typing Control U, and then that same meta exclamation mark for shell command. If I type ls now, it goes into my current buffer. So there's sort of broad support for interacting with subshells and shells of various natures to get commands and input from them to plop things in. I'm going to undo that now because I don't actually want that there. You'll see then in the documentation associated with this stuff, various invocations where you say, for this command, if you do it this way, it'll do this thing, but if you type Control U before it, it'll change the behavior of it ever so slightly. And you can also then pass in numeric arguments. For instance, if I want to move 20 characters forwards, that's Control U, 20 to pass the 20, and then F to move 20 characters forwards. It varies from command to command how they respond to arguments like that. Some of them are more useful than others. But when in doubt, consult the documentation, which we'll turn you on to in just a minute. Going to skip the replacing text because that you can do on your own. It's certainly useful, but time is limited. It would be sort of remiss of me not to mention that Emacs has robust help built into it. I mean, it's so robust that they have help on the help. So your standard sort of prefix for this to get help is Control H. And if you want to know what kinds of help, then press Control H again, or as prompted down here, question mark for further options. And this will say various things like, oh, you can search for stuff, you can show the key bindings, you can ask about a specific function down here. A common one that I use just to see what's going on is to press B. So this would be Control H B. And this will pull up a window down here that shows all of the key bindings that are present in the current buffer. You can see there are hundreds and hundreds of things that are bound to various keys in here. And it's not expected that you would, in any given mode, memorize all of these. You just figure out enough to sort of get your job done as you go. But if you're curious about, like, why did this thing do that, that's one place to go. Another place to go is just to ask Control H and then K to say, if I press this key, what would happen? For instance, Control V, your standard paste, it will actually pull up a buffer to say, actually, this scrolls down. So the Control V here will scroll me downwards in the file instead of pasting things. Alt V scrolls you back up sort of page by page on that front. So that Control H and then K to say, about to type a key, tell me what it does. Terribly useful on that front. All right, so let's talk about this buffers and files in business, because most of the business we've done so far has just been in, here's arbitrary sort of text stuff, how do I even open another file along those lines? You'll maybe see in lots of intro Emacs tutorials the key sequence Control X, Control F. This will open up a file. And the general principle in Emacs is you start on a given computer one instance of Emacs, and then you open dozens or hundreds of files in that one instance of Emacs. You have dozens or hundreds of buffers open with shells, with compilations, with text you're editing, code that you're compiling, etc. in it. That you really only need one Emacs. It's supposed to be all-encompassing, which is why some people pejoratively state that Emacs is a good operating system that needs a better editor in it. So the fact that you can do all the stuff within Emacs, it's the sort of Borg of text editors, has absorbed everything else that seems sort of useful in that respect. But mundane things like I want to open a file, Control X, Control F, and then you'll see a prompt down here. Now, in your standard Emacs, which I'll switch over to here, this is just terrible. So Control X, Control F, I can start typing things, but if I press Tab, like I'll get this sort of weird bit of business up here. No hints. If I wanted to open up a work log, that'll be there. But if I type something sort of wrong and press Tab, then this is no good. So my first and sort of encouraging gesture to you is run the following command, IDo mode. Which gives you a much more sort of user-friendly experience in the mini buffer as you run subsequent Control X, Control Fs to open files and change through buffers and stuff. It does a much more sort of reasonable job of auto-completion of things. Once IDo mode is enabled, this will augment and override a lot of those things. So down here, as I type Control X, Control F, it doesn't run the standard one. It runs one that hints at here are some possible things that you can do. And if I start typing things like .org, even though this is at the end of the file, it just shows here are the two .org files that are in here. Folks who are accustomed to auto-completion everywhere will find this much more palatable along those lines to what they're in. If you get good at this thing, there's also ways to sort of cycle quickly between choices that you've narrowed there. So that find file business, that's fairly standard, and it's much more common to do things via Control-X, Control-F than to come up to some menu and sort of open something along those lines. As you have lots of buffers open, you can change in between them with Control-X-B, and this will pull up in the mini buffer then a bunch of options down here that are possibilities to change the buffer. For instance, we were recently editing this thing, so if I type that survey results parse business, then my sort of first completion here will be this thing. Pressing enter will change me back over to this buffer that we had a moment ago. When you forget how many buffers do I have open and what are they, Control-X followed by Control-B will open up a buffer that has all the buffers in it. And this thing functions sort of like that directory editing mode that you were mentioning before, except these don't correspond to files on the file system. They correspond to all the different things that Emacs has open at the moment. Some of them are files, like this list main. Others are directories. Others are interesting things like the process editor that shows any of the processes that are open at a given time. This thing then helps you and replaces this sort of, here's my many tabs that are open, and I have to sort of scroll through them over here. And interestingly, all your standard commands work in here, like Control-N moves to the next line, Control-S allows me to search for things in here. So this ability to sort of select buffers by searching text in here sort of wraps around then that I can work with buffers and select them using the same basic movement and editing techniques that I've learned to edit text files. Pressing enter here will open up this buffer for my use. So Emacs is meant to be self-contained in that respect, that you can get to anywhere or anything that's open by making use of facilities that are built into it. Good so far? Okay. So back to that org business. I think that covers most of the sort of standard navigation between stuff. When you've edited something, and you notice the little stars down here, I've changed something, probably for ill down here. Control-X, Control-S will save it, and you can see response down here. I actually wrote this file. And yeah, after an hour and a half, you finally figure out how to save a file in Emacs. I think that's sort of indicative of where the focus is at. There are some variants of this, and if you have a lot of files open, you want to make sure you save all of them, and then it's Control-X and then just S, and it will prompt, here are all the things that are open. Do you want to save all of them? So this one, yes, I do. This one, no, I don't. This one, yes, I do, etc., etc. And once it's through with that, everything that could be saved has been saved, or the things that you said no to weren't. Now, so the thing that you wanted, sir, the directory editing business. It's called dir-ed mode, and it's a major mode, one that I think is worth dwelling upon for our last few minutes together. Pressing Control-X and then D will open up a directory instead of a file. So in this case here, I'm going to go into this lectures directory, and you see there are a bunch of files that are in here. Your standard movement operations work, like Control-N to go to the next line, Control-P to the previous line, but it's the case there are a few other special ones, like N will move down a line, P will move down a line. There are a few other special ones, like carets will move between subdirectories and so forth. You can do kind of interesting things, like pressing I will take this directory and insert it lower down in here. So I've got one buffer that has a couple different directories in it. But pressing enter on any of the files in here will open them. For instance, if I wanted to look at this 02 Emacs file, pressing enter on it will open it in the current buffer. I'm going to get rid of this one for the moment. Opening this empty file here will open up in it here. That's fine. And opening another sort of directory will open up that directory in here. This one now happens to be empty. A few keystrokes that I think are worth noting. You can go up a directory with the sort of top caret. That's the thing that's above 6 on your keyboard. So Shift 6 will go up a directory, up a directory, up directory. In Unix, so you can go all the way up to the top here. Navigate along those lines if you're so inclined. The one that is really killer, and I'll use my sort of buffer editing sort of list of open buffers here to come back to lectures. And actually, I just want to, so I'll kill this one, and that goes away. So we'll come back to tool time here in lectures. The one that's really killer, that is worth knowing about, is the fact that right now this is read only, but I can change that with this Control X, Control Q business. Control X, Control Q will report to me that something has changed in here, and importantly, little percents over here indicating this was read only, they're gone, which means I can type in here just as I normally would. For instance, blah, blah. At this point, this thing looks kind of like a text file. I can make changes to it, use column editing. For instance, here, if I wanted to insert some text like 01, plop that stuff in. And as the initial report indicated, none of this stuff is saved yet, but the keystroke Control C will do so. And this writes back any edits I made as if it were file changes. A super useful way to rename a whole bunch of files in one fell swoop using standard editing commands. That one I've just gotten miles and miles of use out of because it's standard for me to write some lecture slides, to have some codes and a directory, and then a zip file with that stuff. And if I can change them all in one fell swoop, this makes life a lot more palatable from directory management. You can do those things on the shell by typing, move and move and move, or you can do it in a GUI by clicking on something and pressing F2 and then changing the name and so forth. But this is just way faster on that front. Want to undo the changes I just did? Well, let's see. I'd put this back into not read only, change this thing back, change this thing back. And change this thing back, and we're back to sort of renamed. So changing names and directories is as easy as editing text files. A lot of other tricks in here, including if I wanted to get rid of certain things like this guy and this guy, you can mark them for deletion. X will execute that deletion, get rid of them along those lines, but you can sort some of those out on your own. Does that satiate your curiosity about Direct mode?
Yep.
Okay, cool. And it'll explain why if you see me active in lecture at any point, I rarely change over an actual terminal because I don't need to do stuff to find things. If I want to navigate the file hierarchy, I'll jump into this thing instead. And if I want to open up a shell, it's as easy as MetaX shell. Which will get me in an interactive shell along here, which does your standard ls and pwds and gccs and so forth over here. The nice part about interactive modes like this one are that, again, your standard text editing stuff works. Control P goes up a line. I want to copy this stuff. I want to move it over here into some new file like x.txt. Voila, I have that. I want to take this whole region. I'll copy it over here instead if I'm trying to create some example for some class, and voila, you have it. You don't sacrifice much because down here on the terminal itself, things like Alt-P will recall command history. And things like meta-R will do a regular expression search backwards in history if I wanted to get back to that ls or that GCC or things along those lines. So the editing facilities that you're acquainted with are present here, along with a whole bunch of other goodies that are useful in the shell. Making sense? Okay. As you can see, let's see, we're, maybe 2/3 of the way done with what's in there. But we've hit, I think, on some of the major points that make Emacs interesting as an editor. The last thing I want to demonstrate before I let you go, and this will take another 2 minutes and put us over by 7 minutes, more or less, is a standard editing cycle. Now, for those of you who are editing C files or Java files or other sort of things that you need to go through this compile cycle of write some code, compile it, and fix any syntax errors, and get it running, and then eventually sort of run maybe the application or run tests associated with it. This will be the sort of killer feature that you'll look for and maybe why you adopt Emacs in the first place. Or may make you say, like, my editor already does this, so I don't give a hoot about Emacs. It's cool for other reasons, but not the one I'm interested in. To that end, every major mode in Emacs has special keybindings associated with it, but the important ones that come to compiling and checking on errors in code are as follows. You'll usually have a compile command tied up oftentimes with a make or other build system, although you can run a GCC manually in this as well. We'll see an example of that in a second. But if any errors result from that compilation, they'll show up in this other buffer, and you can navigate between the errors with the commands MetaG and the next for the next error and MetaP for the previous error, which will position your cursor at the file where something went wrong. The best way to do this is to demonstrate it in the context of course stuff. I've seeded in here some code, this C list application with some errors. So for instance, I was editing this list main. I am ready to compile this code and see what it does. You type compile. This is a long form command that you'll probably eventually sort of rebind to something more convenient. I usually do Control C to run compile stuff. But you can see there's a prompt down here to requesting how do you want to build this thing. Standard is just make for that front. And as I type enter here, it'll prompt, do you have any files you want to save? Preventing one of the most common errors, like I made some changes but forgot to save the file. Emacs has got your back on that front. Don't really care about these, but I'll save them anyway. And you notice down here that everything went hunky-dory. This is your sort of standard procedures, like all is going well, and so I feel good about this. I can go on to do whatever else it is, run tests, etc. But most of us are acquainted with the fact that this is rarely the case. So let me quickly run a different compile, make C errors, which will change the C code in here to introduce some errors. So your standard then of running compile will be, instead of like everything went hunky-dory, I got a bunch of errors here. I'm going to transpose this a little bit so you can see. This is the results as if I typed make on the command line. This is output that make would tend to generate, along with some highlighted stuff that indicates, oh, these are things that went wrong. That set of keystrokes I mentioned a moment ago, MetaG and then N to move to the next, move this thing up so that the most recent error that I'm looking at is at top, and it pertains to list main, line 40, col 12. That's exactly where I am now, having done it. And anybody who's edited C code can see you need a semicolon. Easy one to fix. I'll plop that in here. And over here in my sort of other window associated with this, I'll recompile by typing just G to refresh this. And you'll see, do you want to save this thing again, preventing me from doing that business? Still got errors. Here's MetaG to go to the next one. And this one looks a little bit harder, but after you stare at it a while, you'll see all these things use CMD. So I used a wrong variable name, CMD here. Save that thing and compile again. And we're in business for that file, although I have some errors seeded in this other file. So again, MetaG, different file this time, same old problem, semicolon, different file this time. Forgot to open a curly up here. It's probably worthwhile at this point because I made enough changes to recompile. So swap over to this other window. You can see I bound that. Oh, this thing died, didn't it? You can't see those anymore. Screen key, come back. Now, it's not even worth it at this point because we're almost done. So change over to this other window, press G to refresh, got one error left, MetaG to go to that. Forgot to close this curly, and so that should do it. So come back over here and we're in a compiled business. Ready to run tests or whatever else it is I need to do with code. So hopefully then this demonstrates some of the facilities that are associated with Emacs that make it good for editing text, editing code, interacting with the computing system, allowing you to run shells, interact with directory structures, and so forth. There's a lot there. We didn't even get to like one of the killer features, which is org mode, a really useful mode for taking notes. And everything you see in here has been done in org mode, enabling me to quickly export it to text, to HTML, to PDF slides, to a variety of different formats. Apparently that'll be a story for a different day, but I'll at least include some notes on it in the stuff that I put out. Thank you all for your attention, for staying just a few minutes late, and happy Emacsing out there. See you next time.